Welcome to the Everything Podcast. In this episode, I'm be recapping 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown, Season 28, Episode 1, which was originally released on the 25th of July 2025, and I'm recording this episode just a couple of days later, on the 29th of July 2025. But before I get on with my recap, I've got to cover something that connects to one of the previous episodes. So at the end of my recap of The Fugitive Doctor, Dead or Alive Hereafter, I said that I didn't know quite when or if The Fugitive Doctor will return. Now, between recording that episode and recording this episode, it's been announced that Joe Martin's Fugitive Doctor will return in Circuit Breaker in 2026, which is a multimedia kind of event. So it'll be across books, novels, comics, Big Finish, and online things as well, and games. I think it's the other one. So yeah, that's when the Fugitive Doctor's returning, and that will all take place in 2026. So yeah, we know we're getting more Fugitive Doctor on Big Finish. I probably will recap as much of it as I can as well, but I just thought I should mention it. But back to what I'm actually covering. And there isn't a trailer for it, so without further ado, here is my recap of 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown, Season 28, Episode 1. We start off with the 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown title sequence. Bob, Richard, Tom, Harriet, Ian, Susie, Rachel and Jimmy are introduced. Jimmy introduces this episode. Jimmy mentions Vic Reeves and that big night out. Tom mentions one of his issues with public toilets. Bob mentions losing a shoe. Bob and Jimmy mention Hoovers. Jimmy mentions supply teachers. Bob insults Richard. Don't know why I called him Bobby there. Bob proposes something to Tom. Bob reveals his fears. Tom believes Jimmy is flirting with him. Tom mentions Harriet, her boyfriend. Harriet introduces herself. Harriet mentions driving. Harriet recalls a time being chased. Harriet reveals some advice. Richard reveals he has injured one of his fingers. Richard complains about the show's props department. Tom reveals in time he misunderstood something. Richard reveals his mascot. This mascot is a portrait of someone who looks very similar to him. Richard mentions Warwick Davis. Richard believes he and Tom sound similar. Richard does an impression of Tom. Richard reads a poem. Tom reveals his mascot. Tom mentions not being a confident driver. Tom's mascot is a digital message board. Jimmy corrects Tom. Tom misunderstands Jimmy. Harriet reveals her mascot. Harriet mentions Amazon. Harriet's mascot is a slug collection. Harriet mentions gladiators. Harriet mentions her dead mum. Harriet and Jimmy mention Wolf from Gladiators. Tom nearly falls off his chair. Tom reveals where he met Wolf from Gladiators. Bob reveals his mascot. Bob's mascot is a cat. Bob reveals this cat's real name and stage name. Bob mentions Bagpuss and Claire Baldy as well as Batman and Wolverine. Bob's cat swears at Jimmy multiple times. Ian reveals his thoughts on being from the north. Ian reveals the issues with the vending machine. Ian distracted himself. Jimmy mentions Susie's tour, the Blitz and COVID. Jimmy insults Susie's tour. Susie reveals the origin of a swear word. Jimmy compliments and insults Rachel. Jimmy mentions Stephen Hawking. Rachel reveals one of her daughter's responses. Jimmy reveals this episode's prize, which is the Countdown Karate Kit. I'm confused with a different episode because I think I nearly said karaoke there. Rich and Harriet pick the letters. The teams play their first letters game. Jimmy tests some new shoes. Jimmy dances. The audience clap along to Jimmy's dancing. The teams reveal their answers. Tom mentions the Muppet Christmas Carol. Harriet and Richard score 6 points. Ian and Susie reveal this round's top answers. Bob and Tom choose the numbers. The teams play their first numbers game. The team reveals their answers. Richard details his workings out. Rachel insults Richard. Rachel asks the audience if they got the right number. Jimmy insults the audience. Harriet and Richard receive 5 points. Rachel reveals how to get the exact answer. Jimmy defends the teams. Richard believes there needs to be a break between the introduction of the mascots and the countdown games. Jimmy reveals Bob and Tom currently have 0 points and Harriet and Richard currently have 11 points. Bob chooses the letters. The teams play their next letters game. Jimmy bids on a sports car. Jimmy wins this car. Jimmy drives this car. The teams reveal their answers. Richard believes the car makes Jimmy more human. Jimmy struggles to reverse the car. Harriet scores 6 points. Susie reveals this round's top answer. Richard chooses the numbers. Richard and Bob play the next numbers game. Bob plays a musical instrument. Both teams receive 10 points. Ian mentions the difference in him pronouncing the letter H. Ian reads out a social media post from Margaret. Ian reads out a message that mentions the HMRC. Jimmy introduces the Countdown Acting Challenge. Jimmy explains how the Countdown Acting Challenge works. Jimmy lists some projects that Richard has been involved with. These include the Lego Movie and Paddington 2. Harriet mentions having an acting degree. Jimmy mentions Jason Statham. Bob insults his acting ability. The teams take part in the Countdown Acting Challenge. Harriet reveals how she found out she was deaf. Jimmy informs Richard what each of his characters should sound like. Richard demonstrates his accent ability. Jimmy mentions James Bond. Jimmy informs Bob and Tom what the scene they are performing involves. Richard mentions Paul McCartney. Bob demonstrates his Paul McCartney impression. Richard and Bob swear repeatedly. Jimmy reminds Tom what accent he should be using. Richard mentions podcasts. Bob and Tom perform a stage slap. Jimmy gives the bonus points to Richard and Harriet. Richard chooses the letters. The teams play another letters game. The teams reveal their answers. Richard and Harriet receive 5 points. Susie reveals this round's top answers. Tom chooses the letters. The teams play their final letters game. A siren sounds. Joe Wilkinson falls from the ceiling. The teams reveal their answers. Harriet and Richard receive 6 points. Susie reveals this round's top answer. Jimmy reveals Bob and Tom currently have 10 points, whereas Harriet and Richard currently have 43 points. Jimmy reveals this episode's conundrum is worth 34 points. The teams play this episode's countdown conundrum. Jimmy reveals this episode's final scores, with Bob and Tom having 10 points and Harriet and Richard having 77 points. This episode's winners, obviously, are Harriet and Richard. Richard and Harriet have won the Countdown Karaoke Kit, and that is my recap of 8 out of 10 cats does Countdown Season 28, Episode 1. So, let me know in the comments below what you thought of 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown Season 28, Episode 1 if you watched it. My recap if you didn't, put your thoughts on both of those in the comments below. As well as anything else you want me to cover the channel, such study previews or recaps, put those in the comments below as well. Remember, you can also like, comment and subscribe, and I will see you in a future episode of the podcast. And just a reminder that there are now 2 episodes of the podcast released every single day, with the first episode releasing at 11 AM GMT and the second episode released at 3 PM GMT. And with that, I will see you in a future episode of the podcast. See you then. Goodbye.